Welcome, beloveds. Welcome to Nurture the Soul. I am your host today, the Reverend Dr. Velda Love, Minister for Racial Justice with the Education for Faithful Action team. And we are part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar series that centers curiosity and care by providing a multitude of practical educational, innovative, and formational resources to engage with the critical topics facing our communities right now. We feature an array of thought leaders to delve deeply into topics that help us live into a gospel for such a time as this. Beloveds, we hope that this virtual space is a space for connection that cultivates a curious and loving community, and that you join us every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nurture the Soul, and from time to time, look for special offerings. You can find a full list of upcoming digital program offerings at ucc.org/events or any of our social media platforms. If these conversations move you, if what's offered helps to enhance your ministry or nurtures your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 4144. These small tokens have huge impacts in helping us resource you and your community in innovative and engaging ways. Thank you for supporting us, and thank you for being with us today. Before I introduce this week's guest, I'd like to remind you of 3 features that can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. 2 are in the shape of a dialogue bubble. The first has the 3 dots in the middle and is what you use to chat with us and share where you're zooming in from and to continue the conversation throughout our webinar. The second dialogue bubble has a question mark in the middle. Please use this for any questions you might have for the host and our panelists. We will be attending to these towards the second half of our webinar today. Finally, the reaction features can be utilized all the time and as many times as you like during our webinar, and can be found by clicking on the heart shape option. For today, we are joined by esteemed colleagues at the National Ministries of the United Church of Christ. Dr. Sharon Finema, Join the Movement curator and storyteller. Reverend Dr. Cheryl Lindsay, Minister for Worship and Theology, and Reverend Tracy Howe, Team Leader and Minister for Faith Formation. She has more than faith formation. She has faith education, innovation, and formation, who will share their wisdom, insights, gifts, and spiritual practices as we explore abolition, Advent, and apocalypse. Beloveds, welcome.
Greetings, friends. It's so wonderful to be with you today. This is Sharon Funema. I use she and her pronouns, and I am zooming in from the unceded lands of the Lenape people here in what some know as Pennsylvania. I'm really grateful for your presence here today. Good to see some familiar names in the chat. I'm glad to welcome all of you. This webinar is really just intended to offer up some of the rich conversation that is already being created and curated in our Abolition Advent Calendar for this year. Some of you, hopefully many of you, have experienced the Abolition Advent Calendar that we started several years ago with the Join the Movement Toward Racial Justice initiative, with daily reflections on Advent scriptures and in connection with past and current movements toward abolition. Always imagining that Advent is a time of expectation, of yearning for the world that we hope for, and starting to build it in our midst. And that world is one that is rooted in collective liberation and abolition, a way of being in the world that reminds us that no one is disposable, that we all need to be on the journey to freedom together. So, this year's Abolition Advent Calendar puts in conversation abolition and Advent scriptures and excerpts from Octavia Butler's wonderful visionary fiction book, The Parable of the Sower. It seemed like the right time to come to that book and its visions of a future that unfortunately sometimes looks very much like our current. And we're going to use that as inspiration for what it means for us to be practicing new worlds into life. So I invite you to come with us in this conversation to get a little taste of what the Advent calendar has for you this year and to be present with each other in this very complicated and trying and challenging moment where we get to dream about what is possible for us as things begin to crumble or continue to crumble, what new thing is being born.
Hello, good people. My name is Tracy Howe. My pronouns are she and they, and I am zooming in from the ancestral land and unceded land of the Tohono O'odham people and Pasquayaqui people in what is also called Tucson, Arizona. I am really honored to be a part of this conversation with my dear friends and colleagues and expect to learn and uh, be challenged through this conversation and hopefully some of your questions and reflections. And we want that to enter our whole bodies, not just our minds, not just our ear holes, but through our breath, through our being, in hopes that we might be transformed in every moment that we come together, that there is an opportunity to be transformed. So we're going to take time to breathe, which is a beautiful way to be deeply in our bodies as we go through this conversation. So I'll start with this first one. We're going to breathe into the count of 4 and down to the count of 4. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. Again, in, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. One more time on your own. Out. And beloveds, as you're grounded, maybe seated or standing, or however you're coming here, I want you to take the time to feel your back and your spine. And this time, as you breathe in, you're going to inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones, and exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. So inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones, and exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. Inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones, and exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. And one more deep breath on your own. Amen.
As we begin to dive into this book, I want to just allow us to hear a little bit about how Octavia Butler has impacted and influenced where we are today. This allows us to have a better sense of when we are reading her book or books, that we have a sense of not only who she is, but how she is leading us in this moment of chaos, both in our nation and globally. Climate chaos, government chaos, political chaos, and people chaos. And when we look at the ways in which we function, we want to be able to understand that Parable is not a book about science, but it gives us a hope for the future. It is not a book about politics, but it gives us a glimpse of where we are today. So I want to begin with Octavia Butler. Who is she? Amazing. If you've read the book, you have a glimpse into how Octavia begins to invite us into her intellectual and her artistic movement into Afrofuturism. I'll define that for you. Afrofuturism is a space in which people of African descent have a sense of their being in this world and imagine not just surviving, but thriving beyond chaos. They reimagine and envision their lives in a way that they can lead people of African descent, people who identify as Black, people who identify as non-binary. Within that scheme of being of people, they are politically aware, culturally aware, and they are guided by the wisdom of their ancestors. Those are ways in which Afrofuturism allows us to live in the moment and have a vision for the future. And so Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower was released in 1993. She was a Black woman descended from enslaved people in Louisiana and raised by a strictly religious mother in Los Angeles. She was educated at a community and regional college, and out of the ways in which her life began to create stories, she left us too soon at the age of 58. But her visions fit the ways in which the chaos and the disorienting flashbacks that you get in Parable of the Sower brings us into this moment where we're looking at the devastating wars in our time, both in Ukraine and in Gaza. We're looking at the ways in which all of the ways that we understand democracy that are supposed to be liberating us are being met with authoritarianism and fascism. I said it out loud. We are also paying attention to how this moment is impacting us through climate change. And we meet sort of the heroine, the journeyer, the one who is creating this journal of Earthseed. And her name is Lauren Oya Olamina, a teenage Black girl growing up in a post-apocalypse society decimated by all of the chaos. She lives in a community with her family and several others who have separated themselves from the horror that is outside of their community in order to survive and to look at ways in which their thriving becomes possible. But Lauren has a sense, has an innate sense within her DNA. And as I went through this book again, I said it was wisdom from the ancestors that landed in her to be hypo-emphatic, extremely sensitive to the feelings of others around her. Can you imagine what that would be like? Both scary and yet gifted. She has this sensory perception that leads her into spaces where she can not only protect others, but she has these visions and she has an opportunity to reclaim religion and faith through what we know as Earthseed as we are reading the book. And we're reading this in a way that allows us to lean into her vision as she is leading people out of the community after it has been devastated by folks from the outside that are bringing violence and threats to the community through loss and the ways in which there is no one that is absolutely leading them, and not to a promised land, but leading them into a space that Lauren envisions will be part of a new hope. I just want to read a quote from the book that helps ground us as we move forward in our conversation and our listening. In 2020, out of chapter 10, in 2026, Earthseed, the books of the living. When apparent stability disintegrates, as it must, God is change. People tend to give in to fear and depression, to need and greed. When no influence is strong enough to unify people, they divide, they struggle, one against one, group against group, for survival, position, power. They remember old hates and generate new ones. They create chaos and nurture it. They kill and kill and kill until they are exhausted and destroyed, until they are conquered by outside forces, or until one of them becomes a leader. Most will follow, or a tyrant most will fear. As we move into this conversation, Lauren's fears become a reality, but she is journeying with people who want to be liberated, free, fed, and nurtured. And so we lean into Lauren and the ways in which she opens up a space for us to imagine beyond the apocalypse.
Relatives, let's breathe in and out again. We inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones, and we exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. We inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones, and exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. We inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones, and exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. One more time. Inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones, and exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Reverend Dr. Cheryl A. Lindsay, and I'm joining you today from a place that is temporary for me as I'm traveling, Boston, Massachusetts, which has recognized the traditional, unceded, ancestral, and contemporary land of the Massachusetts, Pentucket, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc peoples. And I will share a reading on Advent. The season of Advent gives us the apocalypse each year, not only so that we might recognize it when it comes, but also, and perhaps especially, that we might enter more mindfully into our present landscape and perceive the signs of how God is working out God's longing in the world here and now. The root meaning of the word apocalypse, after all, is revelation. And God is, in every time and season, about the work of revealing God's presence. The one who came to us 2 millennia ago as Emmanuel, God with us, and who spoke of a time when love, justice, and freedom would come again in fullness, reveals this present, even now, in our midst. Advent reminds us year in and year out that although we are to keep awake to signs of what is to come, we must be rooted in the life of the earth and in the rhythm of our daily lives here on earth. Christ bids us to practice the apocalypse. Amid the destruction and devastation that are ever taking place in the world, Christ beckons us to perceive and to participate in the ways that love is already seeking to bring redemption and healing for the whole creation, the whole of creation. And that comes from Jan Richardson.
So we're just going to take some time to be in conversation about these overlapping constellation of things that we're putting together in the Abolition Advent Calendar this year. Parable of the Sower, practicing new worlds, Advent, abolition. So the first question I want to pose to this august group of theologians and reflectors is about Parable of the Sower. What's your favorite part of the book? Why do you think that this is a story we need for Advent this year?
I would like to go first so that my favorite part is not stolen by others. I'm just kidding. There's plenty of favorite parts in this book. Uh, I think I just am like when I read the book and then I just continue to think about the ideas of it, what I see so clearly and what I love, and what challenges me to see and build in my current reality is that when Earth seed is being developed and growing, they're they're in movement. There's they've lost everything. They're displaced. They've been subjected to horrible violence that is Lauren's community and family, and then they're discovering more along the way. And it is in that context that Lauren continues to have vision, revelation, and that people are coming into it. So I think my favorite part is I think when she realizes that people are like converting to Earthseed, that it's actually growing now and becoming something, and that is just incredible and something I really believe in as a Christian rooted in the gospel. That no matter what our circumstances are, this the presence of God and the promises of God are real. That we can continue to thrive in a certain kind of way. That is, we can manifest these good things of the spirit, care and beauty, um, and belonging. And so that's the part that I'll highlight. Though I love a lot of places in the book.
I'll follow the esteemed Tracy Howe. And um, I think about this moment, and as a woman of African descent, which is how I self-identify, I often think of what I would do and what Lauren has done to survive. And there's a quote in chapter 2, and it states, "I can take a lot of pain without falling apart. I had to learn to do that." That stayed with me because I often wonder what it would take to survive in post-apocalyptic, or even in this moment, as we have all stewarded people through the pain of last year's election, and we have seen the decimating impact of not being able to see our churches and our communities feed themselves because their benefits have been cut. The reality of evil, I name that. the reality of human beings not caring about other human beings. And so, what does it mean to be able to take all of this pain and learn from it and then journey out into an unknown in order for people to survive and find a way to feed themselves and create new community? I think and believe that is a possibility that I find in Lauren, that there can be a new envisioning of God being part of this new creation. However, we identify Creator, God, without having these barriers, how can we envision God in a larger context of both protector and seer, of being an empath as well as one that can and has the ability to destroy, right? And how do we hold that intention? And I believe that Lauren does that well in the book because she has to be violent in order to live. And she has to protect in order for Earthseed to become a reality.
So when I was in seminary, I had to do some psychological counseling and evaluation. One of the things, the feedback I received from that was that on a scale of 100%, I was in the 97th percentile for empathy, which I, at the time, said, oh, I don't think the comment was, you feel things for other people more than they do. And I said, that's not true. And then, of course, I had an example a couple of days later of me doing exactly that. And so this idea of being a hyper empath, first of all, to name it that way, was illuminating for me. But it also, as I think about what this moment in time lacks, is empathy, compassion, even the desire for that. And although I wouldn't say that I've necessarily cultivated this hyper empathy in myself, I think part of that is nurture. Part of that might have been passed on from my mother and father. But it is a blessing that can feel like a curse. And in a time, in a season where so many folks seemed to be the opposite of that, like hyper detached from the human condition of others, hyper disengaged from the pain of others. The idea of having this diagnosis and having this condition and having to navigate in the world with that. And despite that, at times, acting in violence, acting in ways that are contradictory to, or that have to be more in response to the conditions of the world, than the innate compassion that rises out of that deep-seated empathy, I think is something that resonates with me. And I'll just tack on another piece that was almost equal for me is, but I think in some ways related, the idea of change, the essential nature and the even more than essential nature, the predominance, the prevalence of change. Change, God has changed, life has changed, creation has changed. What would be different about our theology if, in addition to thinking of God as creator, we would think of God as changer? If we would see ourselves in the image of God as changers, and marrying that with empathy and entering into the experience, the feelings, the perspective of others, with the idea that change is not only possible, it's not only the goal, it is the thing. And the possibilities that are open with that, very arresting from Octavia Butler's work.
Mm, I love that, Cheryl. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about um I think one of my favorite moments in the well, it happens throughout the journey, but all the times that more people start to join the band of travelers. But I'm always especially moved by the section that's when Natividad and Travis and Domingo join Lauren and Harry I don't, and Zara are there by that point. Um, but I think there's this dance that they do of like suspicion and they like get close, but then they are like far enough away to be safe. But and it always makes me think about the ways that we have to build trust on the go in moments like we are in. And that it's important. It's important to do that work of trust building, but it's also like what are the things that teach us? And I feel like Lauren just keeps coming back with this like we're better when there are more of us. And like that kind of leaning into we're safer when we're in community. And it made me think about what you were saying, Cheryl, about um like the hyper empathy and how it's like both blessing and curse sometimes. And it reminds me of all the parts of the book where Lauren has to be taken care of because she's basically taken out um by her empathy in moments of violence. And it made me think about this song that Alexandra Alay Blakely um wrote as part of this album called Whales. And it says the words are, I don't know if we were meant to carry so much grief in one body. But then the second half of it is, but we are not alone. And I like love that she like holds these pieces together in the same way that that Octavia Butler does with the character of Lauren. Like, what does it mean to like be and carry like the weight of the violence that you're experiencing and not do it alone. And that to me is one of the pieces that I like always feel like I need to be reminded of.
Uh, I love all of your reflections, and I am thinking and wondering how you all would respond to um, people resistant to theological change in this time. Like the idea that God is change is not as challenging as perhaps we change God in the book. Um, but I even if I have a vision of a omnipotent God and I'm praying, then is that not like what I am doing if I'm praying and trying to, ask God to dispense mercy or healing or whatnot? And then if I believe in an omnipresent God, which is, God in everything, and I might pray the same way, but I believe so much in the agency of people coming and creation coming together for that transformation to take place. I would love to hear encouragements you have for people who struggle with this idea. And the second part of this, though, is my I I I do a lot of cultural organizing and talk about the capacity for holding possibility is actually capacity that we have to build. We don't innately have it. We all have actually negative bias. And so it could be said that authoritarianism or fascism have neuroscience on its side, and that it's easier for us to grasp and hold on to a horrible story that is known than it is to hold the possibility that is uncertain. And part of the tremendous gift of Black futurism is it's one of the few places that we see people not just building this capacity, but imparting these visions constantly in it. It's one of the few places that I've found where like it's a whole cultural practice. And so first part again, how do you encourage people who are struggling to hold on to change or in this time? And second part is maybe how has this book helped you hold uncertainty? It's an open question. You don't all have to answer, but building off of what I heard in Cheryl in particular.
Well, I think we first asked you to talk specifically about theological change, like under like so. It's interesting because I'm attending a meeting, a Society of Biblical Literature, and in a conversation earlier this morning, is rising up as you ask that question, and a number of womanist biblical scholars were talking about the different methodologies in approaching interpretation. These were all biblical scholars in approaching the text. And a lot of times people who have these somewhat rigid views, I'll say it, about the biblical text, don't know it as well as they think they do, and are centering other interpretations of the text that have been imposed upon the text. And so just using it from a purely textual biblical basis, part of it, of exploring it, is unpacking the world of the text in its fullness. So you could see the changes actually in the book. I'm not making this up because it suits my views. Like, it's in there. And so often our superficial readings of it are embedded, that theology that we have, the things that we hold that we don't even realize that we hold so dear, but aren't necessarily there. So I think having a curiosity is the antidote to me for so many things. Instead of certainty, and encouraging curiosity, let's explore this together. And I think it's the same reason that, and part of the reason why this book lands so well, to kind of get to your second question, is I think the beautiful thing about fiction is that it helps us rehearse imagining. And so even creative people can read fiction, can read someone else's imagination, can enter into someone else's imagination to see something, to envision something, to consider possible something that they cannot create within themselves. And so that imagining and imaging, whether it's past, unpacking the text, or looking at a fictional view. Like, people go in and they watch science fiction films. They watch horror movies. They can believe a story that's being told to them that is fantastical, even that it's true in that moment, that it's possible. And I think if we help people to imagine, then change becomes something worth embracing. And we look at expansively and show how we embrace change in some spheres of life readily, then translate that to areas where we have certainty, where curiosity would be more suiting.
I love the word curiosity. I use it often and a lot in the work. I think the other for me is mysticism, and to look at those mystics that had that creative imagination and wandering and wondering about this vast universe that we inhabit. And when it comes to our faith and believing in God, that it's so much bigger. Oftentimes I'm sitting with myself and I'm like, can I imagine God 2 billion years ago and imagine God 2 billion years into the future? I mean, how do we look at the expansiveness of God in a way that allows us to go deeper? And sitting with text, beyond text, to sitting with ancestors who had the wisdom to share their survival skills, and then sitting with those cultural, long civilizations of peoples that had faith, that they may not have named God in the same way, but their spiritual appetite for, again, being part of the nature of world, understanding the whales in the sea and the seals and the birds of the air. How do we make that connection both within our text so that we are able to listen to those who have wisdom for the change? Right? Their change is so grounded in them being grounded in the earth. And a lot of that also allows for the wisdom. And so I often go back to Harriet Tubman. She's one of my favorite sheroes, and I use womanist theology and Black liberation theology. But when I look at Harriet Tubman, who did not go to seminary and yet knows God, who did not read scripture at that time and yet was guided by the earth. And so I'm wondering how we can suspend our narrow view of both theologies, theology, as well as text, so that we have an interpretation that comes from people that have stewarded this earth longer than we have.
Yeah, I was just gonna chime in and just add, I think Advent is such a great time to think about God and change because literally God was born. Like nothing gets more changeful than that, I think. And I think about all the different imaginings that had to happen for that to happen. I was in particular in that moment thinking about how Joseph had to reimagine and adapt whatever the story was telling him that the right thing to do was to divorce Mary. He had to change that story, he had to reimagine it. And thinking about all the different ways that people are invited to co-create with the divine in the different stories that are part of our Advent journey in the lectionary from John and Elizabeth and Zechariah, and there are just so many characters whose main way of being is to um, be part of bringing this new form of God to birth. So I feel like this is the a wonderful invitation to build some of those capacities for um, holding change, holding uncertainty. And we've got some pretty amazing scriptural ancestors to hold and dwell with in that, and to imagine ourselves through their stories. What would it be like to be Mary or Joseph or Elizabeth or John in these days? Did you want to comment, Tracy, or should I go on to the next question?
I'm just soaking in all of the beautiful reflections and wisdom. So yes, please, you can move us on while I internally process. Thank you so much, all.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think one of the great joys of this year's Abolition Advent Calendar for me has been leaning into the wisdom that Reverend Dr. Love has shared often in spaces I have been in with her over the course of this past year since the election. Um, and the idea of we have wisdom, we have ancestors who have been here before and who have lived through these kinds of days, and they have something to teach us about that, of what it means to survive and thrive and resist in moments like this. And so part of what we did with the Abolition Advent Calendar this year was to really dig into um, some profiles of abolitionists and to kind of use them as inspiration for what it is that we can be learning. So I got to learn a lot more about some people I already knew about and meet some new people, and it was really fun to do the research and discover things about David Ruckles, who like created the first African American bookstore in New York in like the 1800s and made it a library so that because people of African descent weren't allowed to go to public libraries. And it just was so inspiring to me to think, oh, look at that abolition. Like, what is it to use our libraries as places of abolition in these moments? So I wonder, um, from each of you, if there are abolitionists from the past or the present that inspire you or give you ideas or help you rehearse imagining for this moment. What do you witness in these lineages for our hearts and spirits in these days?
I'll start as I was captured by children during both the civil rights movement, children in our text, children of stories of children that led um, abolition movement when they left school in the 60s and marched despite the violence that was going on around them. And so in this year, my contribution was, what if the children lead us? To be able to be bold enough, to be encouraged enough to walk away from institutional and systemic harm and move into and envision with them. I thought about the way that they would create games while they were waiting to get to a new place in their thriving. I thought that they would pull out a rope and then instead of hanging things, they would jump double dutch and then they'd sit down and figure out a strategy on how these ropes could help them get across perhaps a river if they needed it. It was just leaning into children's stories, even fictional stories about children, that sparked my imagination about this Advent season and how to spend more time with them, how to really listen to them and discover their gifts. And what if we had more insights from them about how to live in this season and beyond the season, and how to be creative and how to create joy in one another in our relationships? And I would ask a child, what does it mean to trust your friends? So differently than adults. What does it mean to love your neighbors so differently than adults? And what is a new, what is not just government, but what does it mean when people can eat? And ask the children. I would just listen to children more in this Advent season as liberation and collective liberation scholars and the ways in which they build not just solidarity, but the way that children can build community and play with each other and learn from each other and use that as they move into becoming the next.
Amen. Um, I uh, I love that you took a moment to recognize, like, what Reverend Dr. Love often shares, like our ancestors have already been through this, and there is so much wisdom for all of the things that we're dealing with currently. And there's also people alive that have, prior to the presidential election, have been dealing with the convergence of these world-ending crises from politics and climate change converging. And I think of the indigenous communities that I'm near now here in Southern Arizona. And one of the most hopeful things in the world to me right now is indigenous resurgence. That is, people reclaiming indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world. And despite attempted genocide, it's becoming stronger, and it's happening all over the world. And I think about, all of the indigenous groups in the Pacific Islands and all of the climate disasters going on there, and all of the colonial violence that has been subjected to, that people have been subjected to, and all of these pockets of celebration, not unlike what Reverend Dr. Love described in these children in the double Dutch, but people are finding they're reclaiming what already exists and celebrating it. And it is one of the most incredible things. And I I tell this story. I was really privileged to be present on sacred land during a ceremony of the Apache people. And uh, the Apache people have a very specific history here in this territory, having not signed treaties and been subjected to imprisonment after what is known as in the U.S. archives as the U.S. Indian Wars. And despite all of the things that they were subjected to after that, including boarding schools and the criminalization of their religion, there are people practicing ceremony again on the land that their ancestors have been practicing ceremony on for millennia. And I heard a song that was being sung, and I learned that this song was thousands of years old and had never been written down. And now these young men in their early 20s and in their teens were singing this song. And I just don't know any kind of power that can come against that. I don't even know how to quantify that kind of power, and like what Velda, you also said about survival, and not just our bodies, but our wisdom and our cultural practices. So that's definitely a huge inspiration and part of what I am grateful to be witnessing in this moment.
So I'm drawing inspiration from particularly from enslaved ancestors. And particularly in this season, and I don't know if this speaks more to my frame of mind or what, but I think of Nat Turner, Denmark. I like the ones who said enough and enough now, like no more waiting, no more patience. And that's not to say that, I mean, in these movements there's more than one lane, and all lanes and multiple lanes can lead to progress. But that's just where I'm sitting. I was watching. I came across a documentary on YouTube a few weeks ago, and I cannot remember the name of the formerly enslaved woman. And she was on a plantation, and she was a cook, and she prepared for what seemed to be around 18 months or so for her freedom, and which she obtained by cooking a meal for a dinner party of the owners of the plantation and their esteemed guest, in which she poisoned them, and she made her way to freedom. And it's not just her in that story. I'm not advocating for poison, but I am advocating for taking your own freedom in your hands. But it was the fact that the other enslaved people on the plantation knew and they didn't tell. They were in solidarity with her. They never found this woman. She she was able to live her life. I think she actually ended up in Ohio and living her life, or Chicago, perhaps, somewhere in the Midwest. She ended up living a very long life as a freed woman. And her story is remembered even with, we think about all the attempts over the years to erase our stories, to ban the books, to diminish the truth of the full truth of the condition of and the attempts at self-liberation for so many enslaved people, that story still endured, and I was able to come across it, as well as countless other folks as well. And then that just connects me to my ancestors, whose names I do not know, but I know were enslaved, because my mother knew enslaved members of our family. Like, she was very young and they were very old, but she was able to talk about her cousins who had been enslaved. And that's how near, how close that period of American history is to us. And so I take strength and encouragement in knowing that, as bad as these times are, there have been times as bad or worse. And those of us who believe in freedom have survived and overcome and continued. And that, to me, even though I don't know if they ever participated in the slave revolt. I don't know if they ever had a little insurrection themselves on a plantation, but I know that even survival is resistance. And I honor that. I honor that legacy. And because of that enduring spirit, I'm here today. And that is not only a source of encouragement, it's also a challenge and a call to me to do more than, with the position that I have and the place that I am, to use all the tools that I have, all of the strategies and the methods and the platforms for the liberation, not just of me and mine, but of all.
Yes.
Can I speak to that? I just want to say amen.
Hmm.
And a moment of, we do what we do at the National Ministries. I believe because our ancestors have seeded in us these lineages for liberation. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that we show up and do, it's not just work, it's call. And that call drives us to make sure that people are cared for. And those lineages came with them across the Atlantic. It comes with people of African descent globally to survive. And so just to be able, we don't know all the names, but to remember that we are here because people cared about our survival and prayed that the next generations would do far exceedingly more than they could ever imagine.
Yes. Amen. We had a question in the chat about where you all can find this calendar. So I'm going to shift us and thank our wonderful conversation partners today for your reflections and your insights and your wisdom, and let you know that you can find the Join the Movement Abolition Advent Calendar on the Join the Movement website. And I'll just give you a quick little preview of it so you can see what joy awaits you. The link is in the chat, but this is what you will see when you get there. This landing page with the description of this year's calendar. And then as you scroll down, you'll see each day's reflection will be on a placard like this, like a calendar. So this is our first reflection for November 30th is here from Reverend Tracy Howe. And it includes the scripture and quotes from Parable of the Sower, as well as some practices that you can be doing to build that capacity for imagining a new world, practicing a new world into life. You can also sign up. There's a link on that page to sign up to receive that same reflection each day in your email. And it will, excerpts from the different reflections will be shared on UCC social media, so you can find them there. So I do hope that you will enjoy this year's Abolition Advent Calendar. And I am grateful for all of the contributors, including these fine contributors here on our screen today. So I want to invite Cheryl and Tracy for some closing words before Velda sends us off.
I want to close just with one more breath. Inhale, exhale. The story of freedom lives in our bones. And exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. Inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones. And exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. Inhale, the story of freedom lives in our bones. Exhale, our yearning and preparing practices new worlds. And a recognition, back to what Sharon shared, as to what in the parable of the sower was one of her favorite parts, and that is this recognition that we do not do this alone. And friends, Velda, Sharon, Cheryl, I just want to say that I find so much courage and hope in the world because I know you all and am blessed to call you friends.
Thank you, Tracy. And I would just encourage us to imagine, to cultivate imagination through curiosity, through questioning, but dreaming, visioning, writing our own stories of what is possible. And not the horror movie, but write something with a happy ending, with a joyful existence, and believe to begin in that vision and do whatever within our lanes, with our gifts, our passions, to pursue it and to write it in the world. And then pursue and embrace joy and hope and love and peace in our corners during this Advent season and beyond. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
And as we close out our time and we give thanks for these beautiful souls on the screen and the ways in which their gifts, their wisdom, and their understanding of a great God, full of curiosity and mysticism, I leave you with these words from Parable of the Sower. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. As we move into this Advent season, may you be touched and may you touch. When that touch comes for you and settles in your spirit, know that you are the changer who can change others. Write the book, create the earth seed, and know that God is with you every day, loving, nurturing, and caring for you. May it be so.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444 Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.